is a war. It's happening now. It will decide the fate of humanity. The time to choose sides has come. We are the resistance. We are the InfoWar.
Welcome to the InfoWars Nightly News. I'm David Knight, and it's Thursday, September 18th, 2014. Here are our top stories.
Tonight, what Britain really thinks about Scottish independence. Then, how secure are Apple products? And the campaign to declassify the censored 9/11 pages. That's next on the InfoWars Nightly News.
Now it's going to come out in the 28-page report that I've talked to congressmen who've seen it, Walter Jones and others, clearly says Saudi Arabia involved, stand down was ordered.
Today, September 18th, is the day that Scots go to the poll to decide if they're going to become independent of the United Kingdom. This is a major decision, not only for Scotland, but for the world, because it's a question of what you value. Do you value your independence? Do you value that over your security? Do you value self-determination and liberty over comfort? That is the question before the Scottish people, in my opinion. Take a look at this picture. This is how it's being posed to the people in Scotland. This Reuters picture that shows the Scottish yes vote says, Scotland's future in Scotland's hands. On the other side, you have vote no. It's just not worth the risk. Let me tell you something. This is always about liberty versus the promise of security. People who are slaves will never have any security. If you don't have control over your life, if you don't have control over your government, you do not have any security or any comfort. But that's what's being sold to them. Consider the fact that the Conservatives in England, the Tories, are putting this out as, say, Scotland is very socialist. True, it's not a perfect country. There is no perfect country. The UK has its problems. The United States certainly has its problems. Scotland has its own internal problems. They have minders assigned to children at birth, following them through decades. Now, the Tories, the Conservatives, are saying that Scotland is too socialist. That may very well be true. Yet, why would the English, why would the Conservatives want to have a country that they consider to be too socialist, too dependent on the government welfare check? Why would they want to keep them in union? I mean, if New York or California wanted to go their separate ways, I would welcome that. They could pursue their own socialist utopias apart from us. Why are the English concerned about that? Well, of course, that's not what they're concerned about. We'll see that in just a few minutes. Look at who is really getting heartburn over this. Of course, it's the bankers, it's the globalist corporations, it's the multinational oil companies. They're the ones who don't want to see this happen. Now, according to the Telegraph, the promises that have been made by the Tory government to Scotland in order to keep them in the Union is now a terrible mistake. They say the architect of a controversial funding formula for Scotland has described his own policy as a terrible mistake after David Cameron pledged to keep it despite a revolt from Tory MPs. However, Tory MPs have warned that the move could be voted down in the Commons, where Mr. Cameron faces a potential bloodbath at the hands of his own party. So let me break this down for you. Even if Scotland stays in, they may not get the promised concessions that the Conservatives have put out there to keep them in. This is the type of thing that's going to happen whenever you don't have control of your government. And of course, the whole point of liberty is always to have the smallest, closest government to the people as possible. That gives you the most control. It gives you the most independence and freedom. That's what our founders in America wanted. They tried to avoid consolidation as much as possible, dividing power between the central government in Washington and between the states and the people. That was the ultimate division. But then within the federal government itself, they divided it down by three. Why? Because they felt that consolidation was the greatest possible threat to their liberty. And that's what we see from the New World Order. When you divide countries out like Scotland, and they are setting off a round of hope throughout the world that this may be possible. When you divide countries apart like this, when people get a government that is smaller, that is closer to them, they have a greater chance of controlling that government. That was the whole reason we had checks and balances in the American government. Look at what is happening here. They're being told that they're getting too many concessions in Scotland. The Conservatives are complaining that there's too much money already being given to Scotland versus other countries, England, Wales, etc. Take a look at this graph. This is what the Barnett formula would provide. This is what they're saying is a major mistake. And of course, you can see that Northern Ireland and Scotland are getting quite a bit more per capita than Wales and the UK. So why would the English want to do that? Why would they want to keep them in? We saw the same type of thing years ago in New Zealand. If you want to look at a country that is dependent on socialism, that follows socialism down the road, New Zealand had to take the red pill because they were on their own. They got to a point where they could no longer pay their embassy staff. It was that dire. They immediately turned around the ship of state, and they were able to do it because it was a small country. It didn't have the kind of inertia that the United States does. It didn't have the kind of inertia that the United Kingdom does. If you want to get people off of socialism, it's like kicking your 30-year-old son out of the basement and telling him to get a job. Eventually, they're going to hit the wall, and they'll be smaller and more able to turn that around if they're independent. But let's look at the real reason. The real reason that the bankers are freaking out about Scottish independence. This is from Washington Blog. He says it's really about oil. Specifically, if Scotland becomes independent, it will get to keep about 90% of the revenues from its huge oil reserves. And he quotes the New York Times, Al Jazeera, NBC, but Max Kaiser explained it, I think, the best. Here's the 3 points he makes. The UK can now borrow cheaply using this giant Scottish oil reserves as collateral. Number 2, if Scotland leaves, the collateral oil reserves will no longer be available. 3, so the cost of borrowing money for Britain will skyrocket. That's why this is really happening. This is why the bankers are freaking out. But of course, if Scotland has a vote and they declare independence, that is going to send shockwaves around the world, from Catalonia to Texas. Anyone who wants to have smaller local government will be encouraged by this. And they'll be encouraged, I think, even if Scotland decides to remain dependent on Great Britain, because at least they had the chance to have a vote. Now, also coming up today, we see that there is a new campaign coming out that Ron Paul is actually pushing, trying to get 9/11 documents declassified. He interviewed Walter Jones, who has put forth a House bill. In this story today from Paul Joseph Watson, he points out Congressman Ron Paul has called on Americans to get behind a campaign to draw attention to U.S. Representative Walter Jones's House Resolution 428, which demands that the president order the 28 pages of this 9/11 report declassified in full. So you can support this with a Twitter campaign, a social media campaign, hashtag declassify. INFOWARS is also throwing its support behind this cause under the hashtag release the 28 pages. Now, I want to read for you this quote from the interview that Ron Paul had with Congressman Jones. Congressman Jones said this about the 9/11 report. He said, you have to go down into a room that's guarded by uniformed officers. Then you also have to have an FBI person to sit there in the room. Bear in mind, this is a U.S. congressman you're talking about. You can't make any notes. The Bush people do not want it released. It's not a national security issue, but it would be embarrassing to the previous administration if this information is opened to the public. There'll be no hope for America's future if the American people don't know the truth about a tragedy such as 9/11. We see these same types of restrictions put on U.S. congressmen and senators when they want to learn about the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the Transatlantic Partnership, trade partnerships that are selling our sovereignty, that are selling our privacy, that is selling things like CISPA, SOPA, ACTA, PIPA, things that have been voted down by our elected representatives and yet are going to be part of this trade agreement being negotiated in secret that congressmen and senators are not allowed to see any more than they're allowed to see the 9/11 report. Now, Congressman Jones also had this to say about the ISIS situation. He said, arming Syrian rebels will be a total failure. Now, this came up during debate yesterday in Congress on whether or not to send aid to ISIS. And this is what he had to say. He said, I think of the $1.7 trillion that we spent in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think about the 4,000 Americans that gave their lives, the 30,000 Americans wounded, and the 100,000 Iraqis who were killed. And here we go again. I don't care if the president is a Democrat or a Republican. This is a failed policy, and it will be proven to be a failed policy. He's absolutely right. We need more statesmen like Walter Jones, but unfortunately, they're in a very small minority because the House approved plans to arm and train ISIS in order to fight ISIS. This is an article from Kurt Nimmo on INFOWARS.com today. He points out that yesterday on Wednesday, the House of Representatives approved Obama's plan to train and arm, quote, moderate Syrian rebels to counter the growing threat of the Islamic State organization. Now, Kurt Nimmo points out that even the New York Times dispelled the idea that there is any such thing as moderate Syrian rebels. They said in the New York Times, nowhere in rebel-controlled Syria is there a secular fighting force to speak of. That was back on April 27th, 2013. My sense is that there are no seculars, said Elizabeth Obagi of the Institute for the Study of War. She told the New York Times. Also, Kurt Nimmo points out that al-Nusra and ISIS merged back in this last June, and that factions within the FSA have pledged allegiance to ISIS, and that there's around 20,000 FSA mercenaries trained by the United States. And he also points out, of course, as we have many, many times, that the CIA is providing the weapons. He said the CIA has shipped weapons to al-Qaeda groups in Syria since at least 2012, a fact that's revealed also by the New York Times. The shipments included, as of March last year, more than 160 military cargo flights by Jordanian, Saudi, and Qatari military cargo planes. That's it. So that's what we have, essentially an organization that has been created, trained, equipped by the American government, and now we have to equip and train some more people that are supposedly opposite to them, that are going to fight them, and yet they are one and the same. Is Homeland Security and the federal government totally clueless about the war on terror? Here's what Joe Biggs has to say.
I'm Joe Biggs with INFOWARS.com. Now, Wednesday, Congressman Jason Chaffetz of Utah came out and said that 4 known terrorists were captured and arrested at our southern borders along Mexico and Texas. Now, he went to a Department of Homeland Security committee meeting where he asked Jed Johnson if he was aware of any known suspected terrorists being captured at all during his tenure as the Secretary of Homeland Security. His response was, sitting here right now, no specific case comes to mind. This is our Secretary of DHS, the man who's supposed to know about the security of our homeland. And he has no clue that 4 known terrorists were captured and detained at our southern borders. You know, we've shown you multiple times, myself, James O'Keefe, that crossing the river, the Rio Grande, the Rio Bravo, this is an easy task for terrorists to do it. I've done it multiple times in Texas, in Arizona. It's not a hard thing to do, but Harry Reid, Feinstein, they all want to come on TV and lie to the American people daily and say that our American borders are secure. Now, what the congressman went on to say, though, was out of the 460-something thousand people that come through, only a small percentage of them are actually captured. So for those 4 that were caught, probably quadruple that actually get through. And we're continuing to find Qurans, prayer rugs, English to, or Iranian to English translation books, money from all these different countries with known terrorist ties, people with connections to Hezbollah. This is a serious thing that needs to be looked at, and yet our country, our government does nothing about it. But they want to demonize the militias when they go out there that move from the middle of the states to come down to help protect the border. They want to call them domestic terrorists, say that they're not part of the solution, but part of the problem. And then the Border Patrol wants to shoot at them. They're just trying to do their job because they're not doing it. Luckily, we got these 4 guys on September 10th, the day before, when we had intel that the 13th anniversary of September 11th could be a terrorist attack. So thank God these guys were able to capture them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you again the video of myself crossing as an ISIS terrorist, and then I'm going to show you the video of James O'Keefe coming across the lake from Canada into America with Ebola and ricin. So continue watching our updates of this, because I don't know how many times we have to keep reminding you that this is not secure, that the terrorists can come through. We're not saying it will happen. We're just informing you that it is easy for this to happen.
How did you get here? Did you cross in a boat or something?
Well, I used my British passport to get to Canada, and then, yes, I took a boat.
No Border Patrol stopped you?
Do you see any Border Patrol? Do you see any Coast Guard?
What's in that other bag?